Good afternoon. My name is Arisha Isani, and I am the Graduate Assistant for the Future of Public Safety Initiative here at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. I would like to welcome you to the fourth webinar of the Reimagine Public Safety Pledge Workshop Series, which we host with our partners at Cities United and the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, and with support from the Obama Foundation's My Brother's Keeper Alliance. A few housekeeping items. I would like to remind you that this webinar is being recorded. I will also note that the views expressed here are those of the presenters individually, not the Obama Foundation, John Jay College, or our partner organizations. The Q&A feature has been enabled, and we invite you to enter any questions into that box throughout the conversation. We will reserve time at the end to respond to as many questions as we can. For those who are not familiar with the Reimagine Public Safety Pledge, this pledge is an invitation to local elected officials and asks that they commit to investing in at least one of the three key public safety strategies. Number one being empowering communities to address violence by standing up and sustaining efforts such as offices of violence prevention or neighborhood safety. Number two, investing in the creation or sustainability of off-ramps from the criminal legal system through diversion or alternative emergency response. And finally, investing in prevention and restorative justice strategies that heal communities and build trust. Please visit the Pledge website to stay up to date on our upcoming workshop schedule and additional resources related to the pledge. More information about John Jay's Future of Public Safety Initiative, including the report and additional programming, can be found in the link provided in the chat. To join our listserv and stay up to date on upcoming events, please email reimaginepublicsafety@jjay.cuny.edu. At this time, I would like to introduce the moderator of today's conversation, Rebecca Atkinson. Rebecca is the Director of Programs and Partnerships for the Future of Public Safety Initiative at John Jay. Originally from Mississippi, she transitioned from chemical engineering to public health in response to environmental and social justice issues happening in her community. She began her public health career in grassroots organizations in New Orleans, providing harm reduction services, later working for the City of New Orleans to enhance cross-departmental collaboration and eliminate bureaucracy. In 2019, she joined a national organization focused on employment support for returning citizens, and prior to her role at John Jay, provided consulting services in the Washington, D.C. area. Rebecca holds a BS in Chemical Engineering from Mississippi State University, an MPH from Tulane University, and a PhD from Louisiana State University, concentrating on incarceration and serious mental illness. Rebecca, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Arisha. And before I introduce our panel, I wanted to start by highlighting some of the innovative approaches that are happening in our pledge communities and how they support a holistic, community-driven framework for public safety. So for example, through its Office of Community Safety, the City of Greensboro, North Carolina, launched the Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion Team in partnership with that city's police department. The City of Mount Vernon has joined other communities across the state of New York in the Snug Street Outreach Plan. It uses a public health approach to address gun violence by identifying the source, interrupting the transmission, and treating individuals, families, and communities affected by violence. And the police department in Port Arthur, Texas, has created a mental health unit, and its main objective is to assist family members and residents by partnering with local hospitals and mental health services to connect individuals to various providers. We invite you to learn more about these and the other pledge communities on our Reimagine Public Safety Pledge website. And now I'd like to introduce our featured speakers. And as they're being introduced, we'll be dropping a link to their full bios into the chat. I'd like to start by welcoming District Attorney Sherry Boston of Dekalb County, Georgia, Moki Macias, the Executive Director of the Atlanta Policing Alternatives and Diversion Initiative, and Brett Taylor, Senior Advisor for the Community Justice Team at the Center for Justice Innovation. So thank you all so much for joining us. I'm really excited to start this conversation. And so to start, we have such a wide variety of folks who are attending the webinar, and I thought it would really be helpful to begin the conversation with a level set to help our attendees understand what we mean by diversion. So DA Boston, I'd like to start with you. How has your office defined diversion and used this definition to determine the types of programs that you've established?
So, good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. In my office, which is the District Attorney's Office in Dekalb County in Atlanta, Georgia, I want to start and say that we are a felony-only office. So that means when we're talking about diverting cases, we are talking about felony cases, which are the most serious cases in the criminal justice system. But for us, it means the handling of a case which removes or diverts a case from the traditional criminal justice system, while still resolving the matter, holding offenders accountable for their actions, and continuing to serve victims of crime. It is a voluntary process, which involves an agreement between the state, us, and the accused, the person charged with the crime, much like a settlement would be in a civil case. So it can't be forced. It's not like a judge saying you must do something. We're engaging in an agreement where there's a choice to do something. It is also a strategic tool that avoids the cost of incarceration and of over-incarceration in our community and on the courts, and on the individuals brought into the criminal justice system as victims or offenders. And so it allows us an opportunity to give people second chances, but at the same time, people to take responsibility for their actions. So our programs have been established to meet community and court needs. We are looking at ways we can serve our constituents and stakeholders. Can we address the problem of a crime that prevents it from happening again in the future? We look at what are the drivers of crime of our offenders, what are the needs of victims when they experience crimes, and can we deliver the results in a way that's more effective, more efficient, and potentially longer lasting than the traditional court system. And we try to apply creative thinking to those problems and trends as we see them coming into the court system.
Thank you for that. And Moki, I'd actually like to ask you the same question. Your organization has this really rich history and was created through some grassroots efforts of queer and trans people of color. And so in thinking about how those founders define definition, I would love for you to just give a brief overview of your organization and then talk about how that definition shaped the creation of your framework and approach.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here. And as I was saying before we started the call officially, it's great to have Georgia and the Atlanta metro area so well represented. I'll do my part, I hope, but it's great to be here with DA Boston, who's right next door in DeKalb County. The work that I do with PAD, just to give you a bit of context, we are an independent nonprofit organization that works closely with the police department, community organizations, and also the courts. So, we have a slightly different perspective because we are sort of representing a community mandate that really started back in 2014 through the Solutions Not Punishment Coalition. And I think it is worth, just giving a little context there. The work that we do today is pre-arrest diversion. So we meet officers on the street, and we have been involved in a going on 5-year effort to open a 24-hour diversion center here in Atlanta, which will be open in October of this year. So we work closely to provide an alternative before somebody is actually booked into one of our local jails. But the bulk of our work today is actually providing community response to community member concerns where they don't necessarily want to call the police. They don't want law enforcement necessarily involved, but they do want some assistance with the situation. So we've been sort of steadily moving further and further upstream as we have begun to kind of develop those relationships and sort of see those political opportunities to kind of keep expanding this conversation. But it started for us with diversion, and it really came out of a legislative effort locally to banish people for the city ordinance violation related to survival sex work. And, you know, I think what that kind of demonstrated was that there was a real frustration on the part of some community members and business owners with what they, you know, experienced as a nuisance, as, you know, problematic in their community, and also frustration with what the standard response has been, which has been an enforcement response. Unfortunately, they took it in the direction of, okay, well, let's just punish more. Let's punish harder, right? Let's, you know, we're going to lock people up. Well, that's not good enough. Let's banish them, right? And so the Solutions Not Punishment Coalition really came to this with a very different approach, saying, actually, we're not going to punish people for what they're doing to survive and become better off as a community. It's not going to be good for anybody. And so the idea of diversion here that we sort of developed alongside community members and our system partners was to really try and give a tool to those officers that we knew were under a lot of pressure from many community groups, from council members, to kind of make people disappear. So knowing that they were kind of the first responder, right, in most of these situations, the coalition really wanted to give folks that tool to say, actually, you know, we know that law enforcement is going to show up. Let's allow them to make a different decision and to do so to support. So it was not only diversion from the criminal legal system, but also diversion to the support that people were having a hard time accessing otherwise, you know, and I just want to lift up that, you know, most of the folks who were being targeted were Black trans women in communities in Atlanta who were doing what they needed to do. And, you know, membership would, you know, of this coalition would come into these spaces and talk about that, you know, on the one hand, they were experiencing sort of targeting and harassment from community members and enforcement from officers. And on the other, they were experiencing discrimination, violence, disrespect from the very places they were seeking assistance. So it really has to be a both and, right? A diversion from and also a diversion to those resources that are really going to address people's actual needs.
Thank you. Thank you for that overview and just for that reminder that we're not just diverting from, but we actually are redirecting to the appropriate services. So Brett, I'd like to circle to you, and in your role at the Center for Justice Innovation, you've assisted with standing up just various programs across the country. And so I'd love if you could walk us through like how these different communities have defined diversion and the types of programs that have stemmed from this definition.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I want to thank you and John Jay and your partners for giving us all an opportunity to share our lessons that we've learned in the work we're doing. For those who don't know, the center, we are based in New York City. We work with the state court system to try innovative approaches in what we call operating projects. We have a lot of researchers who research what we do. And when we think we got something that really works, they send folks like me who are former practitioners in different aspects of the field. I'm a former public defender in Brooklyn, to go out and work with groups either like DA Boston or Moki's group. So we will work with anyone along the spectrum. So if you're telling me you want to divert someone after they've taken a plea or pre-plea or pre-arrest, or even coming to work with a group like Moki's, we'll work with any group that wants to do something that's, you know, ultimately geared towards helping people get back on track in their life. So we see a lot of different definitions of diversion. I would just stress to folks who are thinking about when you should consider doing it. I think the earlier the better. The court system creates a lot of harm in people's lives, not just from the punishment aspect that they're designed for, but just that aspect of coming to court multiple times, having to find childcare, having to miss work, having to pay for parking. So if you're creating processes to get them out of this system and into that system of care that Moki talked about, my advice and what I would stress is let's do this as early as possible so we can start the healing as soon as possible and get people back to being productive community members.
And so that's a really good point that you raised, just talking about, you know, starting as early as possible. So what are some of the core components that you've seen that have really helped ensure the success of these programs? And also, like, what does success look like for these programs? How are they defining it?
Just getting started is the success in one way, right? Like at least you're trying something, and even if you're not successful, you learn from that success. But what I have found, and I've been doing this 16, 17 years now, the programs that turn out to be the most successful are those that collaborate the most and the earliest in the process. And a lot of times what folks do is they will say like, okay, for like, let's use Moki, for example. She would say, this is a group of people I want to work with. And so in her planning, maybe, and I'm not saying she does this, but someone in her situation might say, let's just talk to the groups that we want to work with to see what we should be doing. And you're missing out on an opportunity to both educate other groups and other constituencies, as also as seeing if they could be part of your solutions, right? And so I'll just give a quick example in my work that's usually court-based. And people would come to me, and I think because I'm a former, they'd say like, our defense attorneys are not buying into what we're trying to do. And I'd say, well, what are they saying at your planning meetings? Well, we haven't invited them yet. I said, well, there's a problem. Like, why haven't you invited them? Well, we don't know what they'd really offer. Well, how do you know what they offer if you haven't invited them, right? And for those who are out there, let me just tell you, public defenders, we're a suspicious lot to start with. We're always wary of anything and everyone. And so when you exclude us from your planning meetings, how am I going to support that? And then even when I say reach out early, so if I want to do something that I'm trying to do pre-arrest, but we also are going to set up a program that allows, if some cases slip through the cracks, I'm going to reach out to DA Boston early on and say, hey, we're trying to do this program. Ideally, 95% of these cases aren't going to touch your office, but some of them might. And when we're ready to include you in some more of the details, we'll let you know. But I just want to let you know now, this is what we're planning. And this is how we're trying to figure this out, so that when I go to her in 3 months and say, hey, remember that call we had a while back? She's not feeling like I had excluded her and then only coming now to like kind of make up ground or to save my reputation if someone's yelling at me for not including her. So it's just real simple. Collaborate with as many people as possible and as early as possible.
And so DA Boston, just to follow up on that, and we're talking about collaboration, could you talk through kind of your process for gaining buy-in from these various stakeholders that Brett just talked through?
Absolutely. I mean, I 100% agree with Brett. We don't have these conversations and cannot have these conversations in a vacuum. It is not for me, the prosecutor alone, to decide, the types of things we should be doing or how we set up a matrix or define, the terms of a program. We absolutely may have our thoughts, right? But one of the first things we do when we're looking at new programs or even evaluating the ones we have is making sure our table is a collaborative one. And that means including our public defenders, our private defenders, our judges, our service providers, our community partners, anybody that's going to provide or touch or really want to support the victims and or the person, the accused that are charged in these cases. You cannot, we always say it takes a village. And that's not just in our everyday life. It's in all the work that we do. It requires a village. And so in order to make sure you've got all the right support systems in place for someone to be successful in a program, because success for us isn't just getting someone that agrees to participate or even graduates the program. Success is that after that person leaves our program, that they're able to move forward in their lives in a way that this situation no longer is a negative impact on what's happening or doesn't become a barrier for changed behavior, and that they can pursue opportunities that otherwise, in our case, because we're talking about felonies, Having a convicted, being a convicted felon or having a felony on your record may preclude you from many opportunities. So it's not just about the one day, it's about, have we also offered the support systems in place that you can continue to find success in whatever it is you want your road to be?
Thank you. And Moki, kind of continuing along this thread of collaboration, I really think that when we're thinking of like law enforcement-led approaches, it's really critical to make sure the collaboration is a true partnership in that ownership. That it's not just owned by the law enforcement agency, right? Like it truly has buy-in from both community and that piece. So could you talk through just kind of your process and the organization's process of really building that relationship to ensure that ownership is collaborative?
Sure. Yeah. I think that it is a really critical point. Well, two critical points. One, DA Boston raised the question of consent, right? Of that you don't just tell somebody they're going to do something, but that it is voluntary and that people really need to make that choice. I think that is sort of the bedrock of any alternative, true alternative to a punitive response, right? Because you are inviting somebody into doing something differently with support, right? And I think that piece is, in fact, one of the kind of critical elements to get buy-in on from all the parties. And it's one of the harder ones, right? When we're working with law enforcement, we are coming up against often, a culture of kind of, you're there to gain compliance, right? Is a sort of command and control mentality, right? That's the culture of law enforcement. And so I think that there is a lot to be said for how those conversations early on, kind of what is held sacred, if you will, right? What are the sort of values that we are basing this planning effort on? It's not merely logistical. It's not merely process related. It is really a question of, to what extent are partners willing to join in some shared values around what this could look like, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that we're all in agreement about our values across the board or about how we might, engage in other aspects of our work. But in agreeing to try to do something that is fairly different from many of the other ways in which the criminal legal system operates, I think that value and really getting people on board with understanding that, there may be skepticism often on the part of law enforcement. We see that, it's if we don't tell them they have to, then why would anybody, right? It's really trying to get buy-in into that, very different understanding of like, what it actually is, recovery, right? What is sort of behavior change for any one of us, right? Like, how are we sort of invited into with support to do something differently, or to be able to make the changes that we need to make. So I just, I know it's a little off of maybe what you were thinking, but I think that piece is really important. And then the other part, I think, about as an independent organization that is connected to and accountable and in relationship to community members, our decision to work with law enforcement has at times been fraught, right? But it has also been like part of the deal from the beginning. And I think what has been really, really important for us is just to be super transparent, to be really, really clear about what information we share, what information we don't, and that sometimes it's not a two-way street, right? So when we have our public defenders and prosecutor partners in the room, we've had that conversation directly that, there's going to be information that the public defender may have about the individual in question that they are not at liberty to share that information, right? In fact, that is an ethical breach of their responsibilities. Now, the prosecutor who may be working with that person is able to share information about diagnoses or other things, and they may freely, but that is not necessarily, going to be a two-way street. And as long as everybody's aware of the reasons for that, I think there's the ability to have really, productive conversations about what people are able, what they're doing, what they're up to, their progress, without getting into, okay, so how much information are then we, passing along to, to law enforcement, and because that can often be, I think, a real big stumbling block. I have more to say on the piece with community response, but
Brett, you look like you wanted to chime in on that one.
I just wanted to also share that, like, be creative in how you collaborate. A lot of times, again, I said earlier, but for example, one of our sites, and this will not be a shock to most people listening here, a lot of folks that come in through the system don't have IDs. So like we can't even get them into a program to start the healing process. And that can sometimes be a huge roadblock for folks. And so one of the sites I worked with, they had a connection with the DMV, and they were able to bring someone from the DMV that had some sort of little machine that was able to like get these folks their IDs right there on the spot. Now, that's something most people wouldn't be thinking of when they're talking about collaborating. They're thinking about police, judges, prosecutors, service providers. But you got to think about like, hey, maybe there's some faith-based organizations out there that provide free meals or rides to people, or childcare, or job training programs that are specifically geared towards a certain population. And a lot of us might not be aware of that. So that's why we always urge people to do resource mapping as you're planning your program, because that's going to help your collaboration and your program building to be thoughtful and think as creatively as possible outside of what you normally think is who you need to be working with.
Thank you. And that's a really good segue into thinking about like scaling these programs and sustaining them. Before we get into that, though, I kind of wanted to dive into the use of data, because as communities are thinking about these programs and sustaining them, it's going to be really important to use data to inform the decision making. And even at the very beginning, using data to inform the type of program to implement. And so DA Boston, could you share just how you all have been able to just start your programs using data and continue to like invest in them and expand them?
Sure. So when we are looking at expanding our programs or expanding our guidelines for diversion programs, we do our best to look at the needs of our community. And in some instances, we can look at need as reflected in the numbers and the types of cases that we're receiving, and what those category of cases and offenses are. However, in order to have proactive effects on the community safety, we can't always just look at case numbers, because those are indicative sometimes of reaction rather than prevention. So we are constantly looking at ways to build out our data capacity within our office. And so, and I firmly believe, and if I'm being honest, data and the collection of data and the analyzing of data is very new in the prosecution space, right? While there are many people that are studying data to help advise, there are not as many offices that are understanding that they need to have someone sort of be using your data for almost everything, not just the work, but how you do the work, how you create your policies and procedures, both internally and externally. So we have hired a data analyst to help us with examining what our data tells us about our caseload and our community. And so when you're building programs and making sure you're using evidence-based practices, we are largely reliant, as I said, generally on external studies. And it's extremely difficult to do both the work and track the work with limited resources. And I know that, we're not alone, but we are putting our best foot forward, because that data really can reveal to you very specific things about the people you are trying to serve and the community that you are trying to serve.
Thank you. Moki, what are some of the ways that you all have used data specifically as you're expanding to additional city services and working with your local universities?
Yeah, so it has been really important for us to continue to tie our efforts in serving people, connecting people with resources, with shelter, with housing, with healthcare, to what is happening on the other side, so to speak, right, in terms of arrest rates and the length of time people are incarcerated, et cetera. So we have a strong partnership with the Atlanta Police Department as far as data goes. We receive a full data set monthly on every arrest that the police department has made in that month. It includes everything from arresting officer to demographics of the individual, whether it was initiated through a 911 call or officer initiated, and what the disposition of that arrest was. So it allows us to really track on a fairly granular level and to do the analysis, to be able to understand what are the trends of arrests, geographically in the city related to the types of charges, et cetera. So then we're able to go back to our law enforcement partners and say, listen, it looks like, criminal trespass has really been a focus for your zone. Can we kind of ramp up engagement with and kind of expectation of your beat officers that they need to try diversion first, right? So it gives us sort of the real time ability to then kind of go back and try and like continue promoting diversion as important. The other piece, as we have moved into providing responses to community members directly, instead of waiting for law enforcement to call us, we've also started to get a little more interested in the 911 call for service data. And I think that is just such a powerful data set because it really shows, what are community members calling about? And then you're really able to see kind of trends in, what is the response when folks do call. I think, we are similar to many, to every place around the country that actually a very small percentage of our calls, like under 10%, are calls that you might imagine our 911 calls if you like watch TV, right? So what we are really interested in is that other 90%, which we really see as the place to focus. What other responses can we start bringing to bear? Of course, there are plenty of calls related to the quality of life and people who may be experiencing poverty or mental health or concerns or homelessness, which are the types of calls we respond to. But there are many others, including traffic enforcement or sort of more administrative calls that really could be offloaded off of the system that just sort of sends every call like this over to an armed police officer, where we know, there is an additional potential for risk and harm. There's a risk of harm. So I think that data is really important. I would say the last is just actually understanding what happens once somebody goes into the system and, what the jail population actually is day to day, what the average length of stay is. Are you tracking whether somebody has expressed a concern around housing or homelessness or expressed a concern around mental health or substance use? And to what extent does that impact length of stay? Because, we've certainly seen here in Fulton County that, we've had a lot of challenges with that, folks get stuck and they get stuck longer if they happen to be more vulnerable, particularly related to severe mental health concerns. So I think that's also an important data set to be using as you start planning out programming.
And we had a question come into the chat about your arrest data. Does it include like non-custodial arrest information as well?
We are able to see copy of charges as well as physical arrests and be able to, see the distinction between the two. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And so, Brett, I wanted to kind of bring a policy piece into this as well, because you've been looking at different organizations across the country. And so as these organizations are investing in or trying to sustain these programs, what strategies that include tracking and monitoring data should they incorporate and consider?
So especially with folks, the first thing you're going to hear when you start talking data is they're going to tell you, that's why I went to law school, because I'm not good with numbers. But I stress to them, and any sites that I've worked with would tell you, my mantra to them is, if you're not tracking it, you're not doing it. Because you have to come back to the funders. You have to come back, if it's law enforcement that's kind of looking at you askance, or your community, or anyone. If you can show a nice story using good data, then you can really make your point a lot better. The other side on like what this is kind of gearing towards what's making a program successful. Is that, I just want to make sure. Yeah, okay. Um, I I just would stress to folks, you really need to get into community engagement and really embrace it. And community engagement is not calling a meeting in your office at 3 p.m. where people have to go pay $20 for parking and show up when you tell them about a good initiative you're doing, and then they leave, and that's it. That's not community engagement. That's telling someone about your programs or your policies. Community engagement is showing up in February during a rainstorm or an ice storm, sitting in a basement of some program, listening to people talk about their stories. And again, when you do that, when I would do this stuff, when I was helping build programs, I'm going to show up and I'm not even asking to talk, because who am I to come into your world and just start talking and telling you what I think you need? I'm going to sit there and listen, and I'm going to show up again, and I'm going to show up again. And that's when people are going to start to develop some trust with you to say, like, hey, who is this guy keeps showing up? Let's ask what's going on here. And then I'm also a little more well-versed in what really is happening in your community. And that's how you get buy-in from the community to support these kind of initiatives. And one last thing I want to point out, when I talk about community, I'm talking about there's 3 different communities to talk about when you're trying to do reform work. There's the community you serve. That's the first one I was talking about, where you're showing up at their meetings at 7 p.m. The other communities are the courthouse community, and a lot of folks forget about that. And so every court I've ever worked in, whether it's a small rural one or as big as Los Angeles and New York City, every little courthouse has their own culture. And if you think you can go into those courthouses and impose what's going to happen without their buy-in, especially with like the behind the scenes folks, like the clerks and the support staff, your program is going to fail miserably. I can just go to Vegas right now and bet on that. If I don't go and really work behind the scenes and explain to people what we're doing, and I always get pushback when I'll say, hey, can you introduce me to some of the clerks? Why do you need, like, they're not in court. Okay, well, I said, just trust me. And they'll always come back and say, wow, I'm glad you talked to them, because like they helped smooth things out, or they gave us the green light for this, or they helped us find a desk that fits into that space that we needed. So that's the second community you have to really cultivate and explain what it is you're doing. And then the third community is all those service providers that we were talking about before. Go out to your faith-based folks, go out to your mental health providers, your substance use providers, your job trainers. Explain what it is you're trying to do, the population you're trying to work with, because there is kind of a lot of folks don't want to work with justice involved folks for different reasons. Sometimes it's as simple as, I don't want to have to report back to the judge what's going on with this person. That's extra paperwork. But, once you explain what it is you're trying to do, and that these are their community members that you're trying to work with, then they start to understand it. So you cultivate that third community as well. And then by having all those communities understand what it is you're trying to do, what you're asking of them early on, that's what's going to help smooth that road out so that you have an easier path to start your program and have it be successful.
And on that point about the community in the courthouse, DA Boston, I want to circle back to you, because like, some of your accountability court programs have been around since the early 2000s. And so how have you been able to work through this courthouse culture, right, to ensure that these programs do continue to sustain and are continuing to support communities?
So sustainability is really important. I mean, a program is only as good as long as you have it, right? And so making sure that diversion is available to everyone rather than to just resourced individuals who can hire attorneys, who can seek diversion, has always been extremely important to me as a prosecutor. For example, when I came in to the DA's office in 2017, they had a diversion program that was, you could only get into the program if you had a private attorney. It made 0 sense. If you were unrepresented, you could not get into the program. And again, that's just ridiculous, right? We have plenty of people that are without lawyers that should be able to access these programs. So in order to make sure eligible individuals are offered the opportunity, we had to resource a unit to make sure that we were making decisions objectively and consistently across our court system. We had to create guidelines. We had to train our attorneys to embrace diversion so that eligible cases actually got referred. I mean, you can have a program, but if the lawyers that are getting the cases on the trial line aren't sending them to diversion or aren't sending them to my attorneys who then evaluate their eligibility, then we're missing out on opportunities. You have to also minimize the role that implicit bias makes in those decisions, meaning you have to understand that if you're relying on your attorneys to consider sending those cases for diversion eligibility, you don't want it to be that one attorney has one lens and everybody else has another. And a part of that does make sure that we are talking about the role that implicit bias may come in when we talk about who might deserve, right, an opportunity to have a second chance. And so that's important. Administering diversion referrals and programming takes resources. You got to have resources in staff, resources in treatment funding, in technology and tools that allow you to track your progress and allow your participants to also be able to track their progress. I always like to say that, I am staffed by my taxpayer dollars to do the statutory work. But when we talk about doing the extra work, right, we're not staffed for that. So we are always talking to our board of commissioners about, if we want to do all of these extra things, I'm going to need more people for that, right, to give it the attention it deserves. And we present our effectiveness to county commissions to maintain that funding. We also use some of our forfeiture funds and grant funding to pay for other costs of diversion. So, for example, in our diversion programs, there's treatment involved in many of our programs. But the question becomes, how does that treatment get paid for, right? Do these folks come out of pocket? Are they insured? Does their insurance pay for those things? We assume none of the above. So we take money where we can from these other sources to make sure that everyone is going to get the same access to treatment by going ahead and paying those costs and making them a part of our plan. We also heavily leverage our partnerships and our community partners with existing government and nonprofit organizations that are willing to offer services, perhaps which they are grant funded for, and we become a valuable resource for our folks to receive those services that they are hoping to provide, where their interests and our needs align. The team we have in the role of strategy, planning, collaboration of partnerships, and executing programming is small team, but we have extensive experience in accountability courts and youth programs, and that's been really great for us. And so maintaining and expanding programs requires a continuous devotion to resources, and we're always looking for more opportunities to build our capacity to serve with our programs. And I'll note one final thing for those of us that are looking in this area, and I always like to say that, We all learn from our experiences and we all evolve from our experiences. And I've been an elected prosecutor since 2011. I was previously, before coming DA, I was the Solicitor General, and I also built diversion programs in the misdemeanor space. So I've been in this work for a while, and I can tell you that my position has evolved in a number of ways just from experience. But one of the most important things I think I've learned from diversion is, for those of you that have programs that are charging administration fees, if you are charging a fee in your diversion program, you should stop. You should not pass go. You should not collect $200. And I can tell you that in the beginning of my career as the elected prosecutor in the solicitor's office, where I was trying to build out diversion programs, we absolutely were charging fees, in part because I felt like that was the only way to convince my county commissioners to give me the money to do the programming, because I was like, listen, if I collect these fees, I'm paying for what I'm asking you to give me back. And, it is what it is. That's what I did at the time. But I will tell you, the pandemic was really what got us to shut off the valve. And I will say, I thought it was okay, because I was like, well, we have the ability for people that can't pay to get a fee waiver. And many people did get a fee waiver. And so we were saying, like, the folks that are paying are people that have the ability to pay. But I've changed my perspective on that. And I don't think anyone should have to pay for a diversion program, whether you're resourced or not. I think we have a responsibility to do this work. I think the state and local governments have a responsibility to give us the resources to do it. And so I don't think this should be about the collection of fines and fees for any local community. And so I think as prosecutors, we should stand up and say that these are the types of programs that our community should pay for, because our community are the benefactors.
Thank you. And we're running short on time. So as we're closing, you were just talking about local leaders. Is there any, and I'm going to open this question up to our other panelists as well, but DA Boston, is there any additional advice or suggestions that you would offer to these local leaders, these local mayors, city council members, as they're investing in diversion programs and partnering with prosecutors or other parts of the criminal legal system?
Sure, absolutely. The first thing I would say is this is someplace you want to invest. Diversion is a smart justice strategy, allowing our community to receive justice and interventions with less cost to taxpayers and less cost to the community we serve. And you only need to know that. I don't care what city or county, rural or urban place you live in. You go to your local sheriff, your local jail, and you find out how much it costs to incarcerate a single individual in your local jail. And I can tell you that if you invest half of that amount of money per person per day in your local diversion programming and services and community stakeholders, you will see a much greater investment.
Moki, can I ask you the same question?
Yeah, I'd love to just to agree with that, first of all. But just to say, I think the goal of diversion should be getting people out of the system as quickly as possible. But that needs to go hand in hand with reducing any contact with the system in the first place, right? And if we stop treating mental health and housing emergencies in particular as law enforcement issues, we wouldn't have to spend so much time and energy diverting people into healthcare and housing from the criminal legal system once they're in, right? And I think that what that will require to make that shift is it will require the efforts of local political leadership, setting different expectations, not having sort of a knee-jerk tough on crime response, over and over again, but rather saying we are going to do something different. We're going to decriminalize many of the ways that we have criminalized mental health and housing, and we're going to seek and direct investments to the actual resources that people need in relation to housing, healthcare, and peer support, et cetera, so that we are not continuing to punish people for suffering in public.
Brett, what about you? What pieces of advice would you like to offer?
I just want to thank DA Boston for that mic drop moment, and I'm going to bring you on all my site visits with me to just say that to everybody. So my thing I want to share with everyone is, and most people don't think this deeply when they think about who's in our system, our court system. And it's, from my experience, most of the people that are in our system have been failed along the way by family, school, and other social institutions. And so if we're going to offer help to them, let's not put up false barriers. Let's not make it arduous so that we get our penance out of them. And let's not allow them to add the court system to that list of failures in their life. And if we all can do this and keep doing this the way DA Boston and Moki are doing it in their communities, maybe people will start referring to it as the justice system again.
Thank you for that. We had a couple of questions come in. They're a little specific. So if there are any kind of global responses that you all would like to offer before we wrap up, I can dive into one of them I think we have time for. So there's a question about community committees, right? What if we had our own community committee? And I think what the root or the meat of this question is trying to get to is, how does that committee get invited to this table that we've been talking about, right? Like, what does it mean to really engage and make sure that everybody who's in community is actually included at that table? And I'll open that up to any of y'all.
I welcome that approach. I will just let you know, we try this in many different sites. It's difficult to keep the momentum, to keep those committees intact and to keep showing up, because usually they get created around an event or an issue. And once they get that satisfied, people tend to lose interest in continuing to be part of that. That does not mean I'm in no ways trying to tell you not to do this. I'm just giving you some lessons learned of what it's going to take to keep something like that moving, and also to be cautious of, it's almost impossible to include every aspect of community in these meetings. Otherwise, you're going to have a meeting with 342 people. So it's just, you have to be as thoughtful as possible. You have to include the voices that are the most impacted negatively into those meetings. And I would just end by saying, not just to invite them to the table, but to give them voice at the table, because inviting them to the table is one thing. Letting them have a meaningful opportunity to talk and be part of the conversation and to come back and continue to be part of that conversation is what will make these true community committees, and not just checking the box and making yourself feel good that we had a community advisory board. So.
I was just gonna say, in the words of Shirley Chisholm, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring your folding chair. And that's what I would say for folks in the community. I get calls every day from folks that just are saying, hey, I'm with such and such organization, or I provide such and such services, and I want an opportunity to sit down and talk with you so that I can be a thought partner with you on whatever it is you're doing, or I want to propose something that I need your leadership on. And so I, while we do our best to make sure we invite our stakeholders to the table, I want to encourage those of you out there not to forget that you have the opportunity to show up and bring your own chair.
Thank you for that.
Can I just add real quick to that, I think our experience in Atlanta and developing PAD was that, in fact, the city was not thinking about doing anything like this, right? We actually created the table and we invited them, and I think, and that I think is really important for folks in the community to recognize that, like, we can set the vision and invite people to join us. And in fact, more often than not, local government is going to be, they are responding to. Sometimes it's pressure, sometimes it's, great ideas. It usually requires a little bit of pressure, but, just to say that I don't think there would be the kind of community response and diversion programs that we see proliferating all over the country right now if it were not for the massive mobilization and organizing that happened in 2020. And so we are all indebted to people actually creating their own community committees and doing that work. And then, on the flip side, in terms of government actors that want to engage community and don't know where to start, I guarantee you that there are always people who are organizing something, right? So I think it really is, to Brett's point, it really is just showing up and figuring out who's already doing it, because folks are already doing it. It's that you don't necessarily, you don't know them yet. So I think it's really worth it to connect with those people who are doing the work in their communities, because it's happening everywhere.
Rebecca, can I just add one last comment on this? A lot of officials don't want to have these public meetings with community. And the most common reason is they say, I don't want people just coming in here and yelling at me. And that's what you're envisioning is going to happen, right? And you might get some yelling, and if you are, probably deserve it, or your agency deserves it. But what you're going to get is some real raw information about what's impacting people's lives and what they need to make their lives better. And I've done tons of focus groups. One of my best experiences was, and this was international, so I don't even have to call it anyone in the States, it was a prosecutor's office. I said, if you're having trouble with this program, let's bring some people that have failed out on this program for a focus group. And they said to me, why? Like that, I don't know, why would you want to talk to them? I said, just trust me, let's do this. We had that meeting, spoke so honestly about all the different points that the system failed them as they were going through the journey. And to that prosecutor's credit, as we walked out of that meeting, they took me aside and said, that was the most impactful meeting I've ever been to as a public official.
Yeah.
You will learn more about your community in these kind of meetings than any other way. So don't
Yes.
be afraid, be bold.
Be bold. I think that's a great way to end this conversation. And so I wish we had more time. We were really just like getting into the discussion. But on behalf of John Jay's president, Carol Mason, and our partner organizations, I want to thank our panelists for such a rich conversation. And I'd like to thank all of the attendees for joining us this afternoon. We have recorded this, so in the coming days, we'll share some resources as well as the recording of this workshop. If you do have any questions about the pledge, any of our upcoming workshops, or about John Jay's Future of Public Safety initiative, please reach out to us at Reimagine Public Safety at jjay.cuny.edu. And thank you all so much for joining us, and have a great afternoon.